Welcome again. And of course, this next topic will not be this interesting. It's about a legal issue. I'm sure that many of you think it will be boring, so I want to excuse myself and say sorry to the interpreters as well and to the people who are not listening in German, because it's about the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, but please stay with me because I think it will be relevant for you in the future as well. So what is the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act about? We already see it's a long term, so it's obvious that it's from Germany. However, I want to talk about the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, and I will use the abbreviation LKSG in Germany. So, we all know that since the COVID pandemic, there have been damages to the supply chain. We all have problems in the supply chains. So what we can see is that the supply chains are actually being renewed, they have to be reassessed, and we have to also reassess every part of the supply chain. So right now is the perfect time to talk about something that was adopted kind of in an intransparent way during the COVID. So what happened? There was a new act, and it is the supply chain law. And the supply chain law wants to prevent harmful violations to the supply chain during any production process of the supply chain. So I already mentioned it. The German cabinet launched the corresponding act on March the 3rd, and the bill passed in June, and it was approved in June 25. Almost nobody kind of noticed what was happening, and that's why I want to go deeper into detail. In December 2016, they asked, or it was the aim to have a voluntary self-regulation. It was about buying a t-shirt for 8 euros. So the act said you as a company have to self-regulate yourself voluntarily, and it did not work out at all because very few companies actually adopted regulations themselves. And this is why the National Action Plan was put into effect, or was created in late 2020 to provide legal measures instead of a voluntary commitment. So from when, or when does this law start to apply, and for whom does it apply? So as of the 1st of January 2023, it holds for businesses with over 3,000 employees, and from 2024, it will apply to businesses with over 1,000 employees. So I think you can see the trend that soon it will also have to be applied by businesses with less than 1,000 employees. So it applies to companies that have their head office, their principal place of business, their administrative headquarters, or registered offices in Germany. So the legal form of the company is irrelevant. It's about the scope of application, and this scope of application will be evaluated from or as of 2024. So talking about branches, what are the regulations for branches? So if your branch is in Germany, and if you have branches abroad, they all count as part of the own business area. So as I just said, 1,000 employees in Germany, or 100 employees in Germany and 2,900 employees abroad also makes 3,000, which means that you have to act according to this new act. So if a company based abroad maintains branches in Germany with at least 3,000 or 1,500 employees, the rules of the new act will apply. So what are the requirements for affected companies? So I'm sorry, but you know that every time we talk about legal issues, there is always a lot of text, always a lot of acts and sections. So what do companies have to do? You have to publish a policy statement. That sounds easy, however, you have to really be careful that you use the right words. You have to introduce and implement a risk management system. And this applies to all parts of the supply chain, meaning starting with the acquisition of the raw material, but also the transport and also the situation in the warehouses. So all steps until the product is ready and sold. So if you take a second to think of it, you really see that it affects many parts of your business. So I think, as it's the case with every other act as well, sometime or in the near future or in a few years, it will be less complicated. But at the beginning, it's always complicated. So another requirement is that you as a company must take appropriate preventive and remedial measures to prevent human rights violations. And just a note, the Act on Constitutions of a company will also be adapted so that it fits and meets the requirements of this new supply chain act. So you have to ensure that you can prevent measures, or that you have preventive measures to prevent human rights violations, and this is also questions of quality management. And you have to prepare an annual report on the fulfillment of its due diligence obligations, and this report needs to remain publicly accessible on your website for at least 7 years. So you see that it also have to do with the right to file a suit, and it's connected to different legal topics as well. What's the impact radius in the supply chains? So, as I just mentioned, the new obligations under the Supply Chain Act extend to the entire Supply Chain Act. However, there are some factors. Talking about the scope or the individual sections, and this is the own business and its direct suppliers. So, if you commit a mistake or an error in your business or in a branch, it doesn't have to be made public. It's enough that you committed an error. This would also already be in violation. Then we have suppliers, direct suppliers. And in the case of indirect suppliers, due diligence can only apply on an ad hoc basis and only if the company becomes aware of a possible violation. So this was the indirect suppliers, but getting back to the direct suppliers, you also have to make sure that they act according to the Supply Chain Act. So you have to really get to know your supplier, and you have to make sure that this supplier in his country of origin also makes sure that there are no violations to human rights or to the environment. So maybe in order to not experience a shock in 3 or 4 years, you can already update your terms of agreement right now, the terms that you have with your subcontractor or with your suppliers. But concerning the case of indirect suppliers, due diligence can only apply, as I just mentioned, on an ad hoc basis and only if the company becomes aware of a possible violations. And yeah, when I think of transport routes, this will be interesting. So concerning review and sanctioning, we have BAFA, the Federal Office of Economics and Export Control, who is responsible for verifying compliance with the law, check the company records, and investigate complaints filed. However, that's important. Failures of violations of this review and sanctioning imperative can be punished with fines of up to 2% of the previous year's turnover. So let me get to the last point, civil liability. Civil liability under German and international private law enables those who were affected by human rights violations abroad to be legally represented by NGOs or trade unions that are based in Germany. So I'm not a legal consultant, however, we know that companies or that people who have suffered a damage have it easy and they can get support by NGOs and they can seek help and somebody who will represent them. So what does that mean for us within our own company? So we really have to check all parts of our supply chain. It's not about primary products, it's about the raw material itself. So you have to make sure, maybe in terms of your agreement, how can I make sure that I don't violate human rights, that I don't violate the Supply Chain Act? So it's not about you picking up the stainless steel yourself in the country of origin, but you have to really have due diligence in your company. So when it's about purchasing or when you tender, you have to already make sure that the supplier will act according to the Supply Chain Act. I know it sounds kind of difficult, but let's talk about the minimum wage. The minimum wage is kind of having a similar basis, and I mean that when it's getting clear that due to the purchasing price, it is not possible that there have not been any violations. So let me make it clear. If you buy a really cheap material, you can already guess that something must be wrong, that someone along the Supply Chain Act is not paid adequately, and probably standards have not been met. So think about it. The same holds true for employment. So nobody wants children's employment, nobody wants children to work, but you have to deal with this topic of child labor. So there are different regulations in different countries. And so looking at the Supply Chain Act, you see that its scope reaches beyond national regulations and not national laws. It says that you, as a German purchaser, you have to make sure that there are no children who are still in the age that they must go to school. You have to make sure that there are no children and no child labor involved in your supply chain, even if you only purchase from someone else. So you see that there are many aspects that need to be regulated, and as I just mentioned, the whole supply chain is essential, and this includes the transportation routes and also the warehouse situation. And well, I don't want to make it sound too shocking. The topic itself, I think, will be evaluated at some point, and the situation will ease again. But now is the point to talk about supply chain. Because our supply chains are damaged right now, we have to look out for new suppliers and new subcontractors, and that's why I'm saying it's the perfect moment to check and make sure already now that you choose the right suppliers that will also act according to the Supply Chain Act. So keep this in mind and think about it when you purchase, when you evaluate your company, and think about how you can adopt the different requirements of the Supply Chain Act, because especially the topics of environmental protection will be included even stronger in the Supply Chain Act. And it's just something that we have to deal with. And I repeat again, because it's important to me, it kind of is like an accusation. However, if you already have a price, or if people see a price, this can also lead to conclusions about human rights violations or violations of the Supply Chain Act. So make sure you think about it and you keep it in mind. It is an essential topic, it's important. I don't want you to panic. I just want to highlight that right now it's not enough to look up for the perfect product, but we rather have to deal with everything that revolves with the conditions and all the aspects of the supply chain. So the depth is important. We have to think about the wholesaler and really also think for him and ask ourselves, where did he or she purchased it before? Thank you so much. Are there any questions?